There's a particular kind of silence that belongs to people who have chosen it deliberately after a long time of noise, not the silence of having nothing to say and not the silence of defeat. The silence of someone who has looked at what the noise was costing and decided, for a specific and considered period, to stop paying. John Lennon chose that silence in 1975 and kept it for 5 years in which the world continued to turn without his commentary, in which other people's music played on other people's radios, in which the conversation about what mattered in popular culture proceeded without the voice that had, for the previous 15 years, been one of its most insistent participants. He was present in the world during those years. He walked through New York and raised his son Sean and baked bread and read books and existed in the ordinary texture of a daily life that fame had previously made unavailable to him. He was not gone, but he was quiet in a way that felt, to the people who had grown up with his voice as part of the soundtrack of their lives, like a kind of absence. And then in the early months of 1980, something shifted. Not suddenly, nothing in John Lennon's inner life moved suddenly, despite the surface impression of impulsiveness that his public persona sometimes conveyed. But gradually, and then with increasing certainty, the silence began to feel finished. The morning he walked into Hit Factory Studios in New York and told Jack Douglas they were making a record was not the first morning he had known he was coming back. It was simply the morning he stopped waiting to be more certain and acted on what he already knew. What had happened in the months before that morning, what the 5 years had done to him and given him and asked of him, and what it felt like to approach the end of them, is the story that has been waiting to be told. The withdrawal had been complete in ways that surprised even the people closest to John. He had not simply stepped back from touring and public appearances, as musicians sometimes do between albums. He had stepped back from music itself, from writing, from recording, from the daily engagement with sound that had been the organizing principle of his life since he was a teenager in Liverpool. This was not immediately obvious to the outside world, which assumed that the silence was strategic, a pause, a repositioning, the calculated absence of someone who understood that mystery has commercial value. The reality was different and more personal. John had stopped making music because he needed to find out what he was without it. The music industry did not know what to do with this. Labels expected product, managers expected activity. The machinery of a successful recording career runs on a continuous supply of output, and John had simply removed himself from the supply chain without explanation and without apology. There were no press releases about the hiatus. There was no announced reason. He was simply gone from the conversation, and the conversation continued without him in the slightly awkward way that conversations continue when a central participant has quietly left the room. The world, in its absence of certainty about what he was doing, invented explanations. He was in crisis. He was in conflict with Yoko. He had run out of ideas. He was planning something enormous and secret. None of these were accurate. The accurate explanation was simpler and less dramatic. He was home, with his child, discovering who he was when no one was asking. This is a frightening question for anyone who has organized their identity around a single form of expression for 20 years. It is especially frightening for someone who came to that expression as young as John had, who had built his understanding of who he was in the world largely through music, who had used songs as the primary language for processing everything that happened to him, the losses and the joys and the angers and the confusions that constituted a life. Without music, he was not sure who was left. He wanted to find out. What he found in the years between 1975 and 1980 was not the crisis he had half expected. It was something quieter and more sustaining. He found that he was a person who enjoyed cooking, who was patient with a small child in ways he had not been with Julian, his first son, during the years when music and ambition had claimed most of his attention. He found that he was curious about things, history, Eastern philosophy, the internal workings of financial markets, the specific beauty of Japanese visual art, in ways that had no connection to songs and no requirement to be productive. He found that he was, when no one was asking him to be John Lennon, someone he genuinely liked spending time with. Julian had grown up in the shadow of his father's fame and his father's absence, the child of the years when the music had demanded everything and the domestic life had received what was left, which was not always much. John understood this and carried the knowledge of it in the specific way that people carry the understanding of damage they have done without fully intending to. He could not undo those years. He could not be retroactively the father Julian had needed when Julian was small. But he could be a different kind of father to Sean, could offer in the daily texture of that relationship, the thing he had not known how to offer before, simple, sustained, unhurried presence. Sean Lennon was born on October 9, 1975, John's own birthday, which John experienced as a kind of joke from the universe that he was willing to receive. He was there for the birth, he was there for the mornings that followed and the afternoons, and the evenings when Sean needed to be put to sleep and John discovered that he had songs in him for a small child that were entirely different from anything he had written for an audience. Lullabies that no one would ever hear. Small private melodies that existed only in the space between a father and a child. At the end of a day, the music was still happening. It had simply stopped being for anyone except the person in the room. Yoko managed the business of their life, their investments, the properties, the decisions that required the kind of systematic attention that John's mind resisted. She was extraordinarily good at this, and John's acknowledgement of it was full rather than grudging. He understood that her management of the external was what made his withdrawal possible, what created the protected space in which he could be, for the duration of the experiment, simply a father and a person rather than a public figure. He was grateful in a way he did not always express in words, but that was visible, to those who paid attention, in the quality of his presence during those years. He was not bored, he was not restless in the way that people predicted. He was, for extended stretches of time, genuinely content, which was a condition he had not experienced reliably since before he was famous. But contentment is not the same as completion. And somewhere in the later years of the withdrawal, in 1979, perhaps, or in the early months of 1980, John began to feel the edges of what the silence had given him starting to press against something that needed a different kind of expression. The domestic life was real and he loved it, but there was a part of him that had always expressed itself through music, that had used sound as the form through which it understood the world, and that part had been patient through the years of bread baking and Central Park walks and Sean's bedtimes. It had waited, and now it was beginning with the specific insistence of something that has waited long enough to make its presence known. Again, he began writing in notebooks, not formally, not with the deliberate intention of producing songs, but in the way that a person who is approaching a decision writes around it before they write toward it. Fragments of melody, phrases that had the rhythm of lyrics without the structure of completed thoughts. Ideas that arrived in the middle of the night and were recorded in the small notebook he kept beside the bed, the same instinct that had kept the tape recorder there during the years of active music making. The notebooks accumulated. He did not show them to anyone, including Yoko. He was not ready for them to be witnessed. What changed in early 1980 is not one thing but several things arriving in proximity. The music was there in the notebooks, waiting. Sean was 4 years old and increasingly independent, no longer requiring the totality of presence that an infant demands. The 5-year experiment had reached something that felt like a natural completion, not an artificial stopping point, but an organic one, the sense of having learned what it was possible to learn from a given period and being ready for what comes after. John also traveled. In the spring of 1980, he took a boat trip to Bermuda, sailing with a small crew, an unusual choice for a man who had not been particularly nautical, but one that had a specific logic. The sea removed him from everything, from New York, from the Dakota, from the domestic routine that had been simultaneously sustaining and containing. He was at sea, literally, with nothing to manage and nowhere specific to go at any particular time, and in that enforced emptiness something opened. He wrote on the boat. He wrote more than he had written in 5 years, songs that came quickly, fully formed in the way that the best things come, as if they had been waiting in some internal pressure and the sea air had simply released the valve. Bermuda gave him songs the way that the reel-to-reel recorder had given him recordings in 1968, the specific gift of an environment with no audience and no expectation, where the music could emerge without having to justify itself. He called Yoko from Bermuda. He played her what he had written over the phone, holding the receiver to a cassette player, the sound necessarily thin and imperfect, transmitted across the Atlantic. The quality of the transmission was terrible. This was not a studio playback, not even a decent cassette recording, but a song held up to a telephone receiver and played across an ocean. And yet Yoko heard it. She heard not only the song but the quality of the person singing it, the specific ease, the lack of self-consciousness, the voice of someone who had not been performing for 5 years and had, in the absence of performance, found something more essential than performance could carry. Then she played him what she had been writing on her own, separately, while he was at sea. She held her receiver to her own recordings in the Dakota apartment and transmitted them back across the Atlantic, the same imperfect medium carrying the same imperfect but real thing. What they heard, each in their respective location, John on a boat in the Atlantic, Yoko in the apartment they shared, was that they had been working independently on music that belonged together. That the album already existed in its essential character before they had been in the same room to discuss it. That the 5 years, which had seemed from the outside to be a period of stopping, had actually been a period of becoming, of two people separately arriving at the same destination. He came back from Bermuda in the summer of 1980 knowing what the next chapter looked like. Not in every detail, the specific songs would be refined, the production decisions made, the collaboration with Jack Douglas shaped through the actual work of recording. But the essential thing was clear. He was coming back, and the music he was coming back with was different from anything he had made before, because he was different from who he had been when he last made music. The 5 years had done what he had hoped they would do, and also things he had not anticipated. He was more patient. He was less frightened of silence, having chosen it, having lived inside it, having discovered that it did not destroy him. He no longer had the relationship with it that he'd had in the years of constant production, when stopping felt like dying. He was more at ease with his own company, which made the music that emerged from that company less defended, more willing to be what it was rather than what it thought it should be. He told Yoko he was ready. She said she knew. The exchange was brief because it did not require elaboration. They had been living in proximity to this moment for months, both of them aware of its approach, both giving it the space it needed to arrive at its own pace rather than at the pace of anyone's impatience. Yoko had been writing, John had been writing, the music existed. What had remained was the decision to formalize it, to move from the private notebooks and the Bermuda cassettes and the phone transmissions across the Atlantic into a studio, where the songs would become records that other people could hear. He was not afraid. This surprised him slightly. He had expected some residual fear, some performance anxiety at the end of 5 years away from a microphone. What he found instead was something closer to the feeling of returning to a place you have always known, familiar, slightly altered by the time away, essentially unchanged in the ways that mattered. The voice was still there. The instinct for melody was still there. The particular quality of attention that he brought to the making of music, the refusal to settle for the almost right word, the insistence on the emotional truth of a phrase rather than its surface sense, that was still there, perhaps sharpened by 5 years of not using it. The sessions at Hit Factory began in August 1980. Jack Douglas, who had worked with John on earlier projects and understood his working method, created the environment that the music required, focused, professional, built around the specific sound John and Yoko were hearing in their heads, rather than around any conventional production logic. The sessions were described by everyone who was present as remarkably free of tension, which surprised people who knew the history, the dissolution of the Beatles, the contentious Plastic Ono band sessions, the years of turbulence that had preceded the domestic period. John arrived at Hit Factory as someone who had resolved something. He was not fighting anything. He was simply working. Double Fantasy was recorded through the summer and autumn of 1980 and released in November. The title came from a variety of orchid John had seen in a botanical garden in Bermuda, a flower that produces blooms in pairs, each half of the pair necessary to the whole. He found the image right in ways that went beyond the personal. It described the album's structure, the alternation between his songs and Yoko's, the record as a conversation between two people who had chosen each other across years of difficulty, and were now, with the full knowledge of what that choice had cost and given, choosing each other again. The album carried the specific quality of someone who had been away and had returned with something new, not the nostalgia of a return to form, not the defensive reassertion of a previous identity, but the genuine development of someone who had used a period of silence to find out things about themselves that the noise had been covering. Starting Over, the album's opening track, was both title and truth. He was starting over. He knew what he was starting over from, and he knew what he was starting over toward, and the knowing was in the music in a way that could not be manufactured or imitated. He spoke in interviews that autumn about the 5 years with a warmth that surprised people who expected either defensiveness or nostalgia. He did not frame the withdrawal as a sacrifice or a loss. He framed it as the most important thing he had ever done, second only to what it had produced. The person who walked into Hit Factory in August 1980 and made music from a place of something that, for someone with his history and his complexity, was genuinely remarkable: peace. John Lennon was shot and killed on December 8, 1980, 5 weeks after Double Fantasy was released, while it was still climbing the charts, while the interviews he had given were still being published, while the world was still in the early stages of understanding what the return had brought. He was 40 years old. The album continued without him, continued to be heard by people who had not yet heard it when he died, continued to carry the specific quality of mourning that had been present in the music from the first day of recording, the quality of someone who has slept and woken and is beginning something new with a full sense of what the previous chapter had been. That morning, the one he had moved toward through 5 years of silence, the one that had begun in a notebook and continued on a boat and arrived finally at a studio in New York, had produced something he was not alive to see complete. But the music was there. It had always been going to be there. The only question had been when he would be ready to go and get it. He was ready in 1980. He went and got it, and what he brought back was everything the silence had been saving.